Florentine villas. For centuries, Florence has been celebrated for her villa-clad hills. According to an old chronicler, the country houses were more splendid than those in the town, and stood so close set among their olive orchards and vineyards that the traveller thought himself in Florence 3 leagues before reaching the city. Many of these houses still survive, strongly planted on their broad terraces, from the 15th century farmhouse villa, with its projecting eaves and square tower, to the many-windowed maison de plaisance in which the luxurious nobles of the 17th century spent the gambling and chocolate-drinking weeks of the vintage season. It is characteristic of Florentine thrift and conservation that the greater number of these later and more pretentious villas are merely additions to the plain old buildings, while even in the rare cases where the whole structure is new, the Baroque exuberance which became fashionable in the 17th century is tempered by a restraint and severity peculiarly Tuscan. So numerous and well-preserved are the buildings of this order about Florence that the student who should attempt to give an account of them would have before him a long and laborious undertaking. But where the villa is to be considered in relation to its garden, the task is reduced to narrow limits. There is perhaps no region of Italy so rich in old villas and so lacking in old gardens as the neighbourhood of Florence. Various causes have brought about this result. The environs of Florence have always been frequented by the wealthy classes, not only Italian but foreign. The Tuscan nobility have usually been rich enough to alter their gardens in accordance with their varying horticultural fashions imported from England and France. And the English, who have colonized in such numbers the slopes above the Arno, have contributed not a little to the destruction of the old gardens by introducing into their horticultural plans 2 features entirely alien to the Tuscan climate and soil, namely lawns and deciduous shade trees. Many indeed are the parterres and terraces which have disappeared before the Britannic craving for a lawn, many the olive orchards and vineyards which must have given way to the thinly dotted specimen trees, so dear to the English landscape gardener, who still, with rare exceptions, the slave of his famous 18th century predecessors, Repton and Capability Brown, as the English architect is still the descendant of Pugin and the Gothic revival. This Anglicization of the Tuscan garden did not, of course, come only from direct English influence. The Jardin Anglais was fashionable in France when Marie Antoinette laid out the Petit Trianon, and Herr Tuckermann, in his book on Italian gardens, propounds a theory, for which he gives no very clear reasons, to the effect that the naturalistic school of gardening actually originated in Italy, in the Borghese gardens in Rome, which he supposes to have been laid out more or less in their present form by Giovanni Fontana, as early as the first quarter of the 17th century. It is certain, at any rate, that the Florentines adopted the new fashion early in the 19th century, as is shown, to give but one instance, in the vast Torrigiani gardens, near the Porta Romana, laid out by the Marchese Torrigiani about 1830, in the most approved landscape style, with an almost complete neglect of the characteristic Tuscan vegetation and a corresponding disregard of Italian climate and habits. The large English colony has, however, undoubtedly done much to encourage, even in the present day, the alteration of the old gardens and the introduction of alien vegetation in those which have been partly preserved. It is, for instance, typical of the old Tuscan villa that the farm, or podere, should come up to the edge of the terrace on which the house stands. But in most cases where old villas have been bought by foreigners, the vineyards and olive orchards near the house have been turned into lawns dotted with plantations of exotic trees. Under these circumstances, it is not surprising that but few unaltered gardens are to be found in Florence. To learn what the old Tuscan garden was, one must search the environs of the smaller towns, and there are more interesting examples about Siena than in the whole circuit of the Florentine hills. The old Italian architects distinguished two classes of country houses: the villa suburbana, or maison de plaisance, literally the pleasure house, standing within or just without the city walls, surrounded by pleasure grounds and built for a few weeks' residence, and the country house, which is an expansion of the old farm, and stands generally farther out of town, among its fields and vineyards, the seat of the country gentleman living on his estates. The Italian pleasure garden did not reach its full development till the middle of the 16th century, and doubtless many of the old Florentine villas, the semi-castle and the quasi-farm of the 14th century, stood as they do now on a bare terrace among the vines, with a small walled enclosure for the cultivation of herbs and vegetables. But of the period in which the garden began to be a studied architectural extension of the house, few examples are to be found near Florence. The most important, if not the most pleasing, of Tuscan pleasure gardens lies, however, within the city walls. This is the Boboli Garden, laid out on the steep hillside behind the Pitti Palace. The plan of the Boboli Garden is not only magnificent in itself, but interesting as one of the rare examples in Tuscany of a Renaissance garden still undisturbed in its main outlines. Eleonora de' Medici, who purchased the Pitti Palace in 1549, soon afterward acquired the neighboring ground, and the garden was laid out by Il Tribolo, continued by Buontalenti, and completed by Bartolomeo Ammanati, to whom is also due the garden facade of the palace. The scheme of the garden is worthy of careful study, though in many respects the effect it now produces is far less impressive than its designers intended. Probably no grounds of equal grandeur and extent have less of that peculiar magic which one associates with the old Italian garden, a fact doubtless due less to defects of composition than to later changes in the details of planting and decoration. Still, the main outline remains and is full of instruction to the garden lover. The palace is built against a steep hillside, which is dug out to receive it, a high retaining wall being built far enough back from the central body of the house to allow the latter to stand free. The ground floor of the palace is so far below ground that its windows look across a paved court at the face of the retaining wall, which Ammanati decorated with an architectural composition representing a grotto, from which water was meant to gush as though issuing from the hillside. This grotto is surmounted with a magnificent fountain, standing on a level with the first-floor windows of the palace and with its surrounding gardens. The arrangement shows ingenuity in overcoming a technical difficulty, and the effect from the garden is very successful, though the well-like court makes an unfortunate gap between the house and these grounds. Behind the fountain, and in a line with it, a horseshoe-shaped amphitheatre has been cut out of the hillside, surrounded by tiers of stone seats adorned with statues in niches and backed by clipped laurel hedges, behind which rise the ilex-clad slopes of the upper gardens. This amphitheatre is one of the triumphs of Italian garden architecture. In general design and in detail, it belongs to the pure Renaissance, without trace of the heavy and fantastic Barocchismo which, half a century later, began to disfigure such compositions in the villas near Rome. Indeed, comparison with the grotesque garden architecture of the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, which is but little later in date, shows how long the Tuscan sense of proportion and refinement of taste resisted the ever-growing desire to astonish instead of charming the spectator. On each side of the amphitheatre, clipped ilex walks climb the hill, coming out some distance above on a plateau containing the toy lake with its little island, the Isola Bella, which was once the pride of the Boboli Garden. This portion of the grounds has been so stripped of its architectural adornments and of its surrounding vegetation that it is now merely forlorn, and the same may be said of the little upper garden, reached by an imposing flight of steps and commanding a wide view of Florence. One must revert to the architect's plan to see how admirably adapted it was to the difficulties of the site he had to deal with, and how skilfully he harmonized the dense shade of his ilex groves with the great open spaces and pompous architectural effects necessary in a garden which was to form a worthy setting for the pageants of a Renaissance court. It is interesting to note, in this connection, that the flower garden, or giardino segreto, which in Renaissance gardens almost invariably adjoins the house, has here been relegated to the hilltop, doubtless because the only level space near the palace was required for state ceremonials and theatrical entertainments rather than for private enjoyment. It is partly because the Boboli is a court garden and not designed for private use that it is less interesting and instructive than many others of less importance. Yet the other Medicean villas near Florence, though designed on much simpler lines, have the same lack of personal charm. It is perhaps owing to the fact that Florence was so long under the dominion of one all-powerful family that there is so little variety in her pleasure houses. Pratolino, Poggioacaiano, Cafaggiuolo, Careggi, Castello and Petraia, one and all, whatever their origin, soon passed into the possessorship of the Medici, and thence into that of the Austrian Grand Dukes who succeeded them. And of the three whose gardens have been partly preserved, Castello, Petraia, and Poggio Imperiale, it may be said that they have the same impersonal official look as the Boboli. Castello and Petraia, situated a mile apart beyond the village of Quarto, were both built by Buontalenti, that brilliant pupil of Ammanatis, who had a share in the planning of the gardens behind the Pitti. Castello stands on level ground, and its severely plain facade, with windows on consoles and rusticated doorway, faces what is now a highway, though, according to the print of Zocchi, the 18th century engraver, a semicircular space enclosed in a low wall once extended between the house and the road, as at the neighbouring Villa Corsini and at Poggio Imperiale. It was an admirable rule of the old Italian architects, where the garden space was small and where the site permitted, to build their villas facing the road, so that the full extent of the grounds was secured to the private use of the inmates, instead of being laid open by a public approach to the house. This rule is still followed by French villa architects, and it is exceptional in France to see a villa entered from its grounds when it may be approached directly from the high road. Behind Castello, the ground rises in terraces, closed in lateral walls, to a high retaining wall at the back, surmounted by a wood of ilexes which contains a pool with an island. Montaigne, who describes but few gardens in his Italian diary, mentions that the terraces of Castello are en pente, that is, they incline gradually toward the house, with a slope of the ground. This bold and unusual adaptation of formal gardening to the natural exigencies of the site is also seen in the terraced gardens of the beautiful Villa Imperiali, now Scassi, at San Pierdarena near Genoa. The plan of the garden at Castello is admirable, but in detail it has been modernized at the cost of all its charm. Wide steps lead up to the first terrace, where Il Tribolo stately fountain of bronze and marble stands surrounded by marble benches and statues on fine rusticated pedestals. Unhappily, fountain and statues have lately been scrubbed to preternatural whiteness, and the same spirit of improvement has turned the old parterres into sunburnt turf and dotted it with copper beeches and pampas grass. Montaigne alludes to the berceaux or pleached walks, and to the close-set cypresses which made a delicious coolness in this garden, and as one looks across its sun-scorched expanse, one perceives that its lack of charm is explained by lack of shade. As is usual in Italian gardens built against a hillside, the retaining wall at the back serves for the great decorative motive at Castello. It is reached by wide marble steps and flanked at the sides by symmetrical lemon houses. On the central axis of the garden, the wall has a wide opening between columns, and on each side an arched recess, equidistant between the demon houses and the central opening. Within the latter is one of those huge grottos which for 2 centuries or more were the delight of Italian garden architects. The roof is decorated with masks and arabesques in coloured shellwork, and in the niches of the tufa of which the background is formed are strange groups of life-sized animals, a camel, a monkey, a stag with real antlers, a wild boar with real tusks, and various small animals and birds, some made of coloured marbles which correspond with their natural tints, while beneath these groups are basins of pink and white marble carved with sea creatures and resting on dolphins. Humour is the quality which soonest loses its savour, and it is often difficult to understand the grotesque side of the old garden architecture. But the curious delight in the representations of animals, real or fantastic, probably arose from the general interest in those strange wild beasts of which the travellers of the Renaissance brought home such fabulous descriptions. As to the general use of the grotto in Italian gardens, it is a natural development of the need for shade and coolness, and when the long disused waterworks were playing, and cool streams gushed over quivering beds of fern into the marble tanks, these retreats must have formed a delicious contrast to the outer glare of the garden. End of Florentine Villas, read by Claudia Canti.